Okay. Thankfully, the Democracy Fund and the Geraldine R. Dodge Foundation have both been key supporters of this work. And broadly speaking, as we describe it here, it's an effort to develop assessment tools for local journalism that we hope can be useful in a variety of contexts for practitioners, for academic research, for policymakers. If, God willing in the U.S., we could figure out a way to make local journalism actually a resident policy issue, which it should be. And then as you sort of got in a sense even from Josh's talk today, first and foremost, actually really think about this work hopefully feeding into grant-making strategy, formulation, and assessment in terms of helping to identify places and types of communities where local journalism is particularly in need of help. We have, across other aspects of political and economic life, systematic indicators, economic health, consumer confidence, environmental health, government transparency, political participation. The list can go on. And often that's done not only at the national level, but at the state level, and sometimes more granular than that. But relatively speaking, journalism hasn't received that kind of systematic and sustained measurement attention really until recently, and could use more. Some of the issues of availability and and gathering of relevant data came up earlier today. So we know it's not really a space where there's been a ton of data that people could draw upon. So the need we see is obvious. First and foremost, what we want to try to do, and this conference has already been huge, I think, in sort of advancing that conversation, is getting beyond the broad generalizations of, oh gosh, local journalism is in bad shape. Yes, but okay, now let's get into sort of the details. How and why do communities and regions differ in terms of the state of local journalism? What are the types of communities that are in more dire straits than others? Can we also track trends over time? That's something that we think could potentially be useful. Can we identify specific types of at-risk communities and what are their characteristics? And then ideally, if we're doing this over time, start to be able to even assess the impact of interventions. So these are the types of sort of underlying rationales that have motivated what we've been doing. We've sort of divided our work up into three, what we're calling tiers of analysis: the macro, the meso, and the micro. And I'll give a little bit of overview of two and then get a little bit more detail on what we're doing in the third. A lot of this is work in progress. Katie later on is going to talk a bit about work that's actually done. So you're going to get a mix of sort of what we've done in the past, what we're working on now, and what we hope to have done in the future. At the macro level, we've done a comparative analysis of the local news infrastructure across 50 states. And there, when we talk about this idea of infrastructure, it's, as you'll see later, it's more of an analysis of just sort of outlets and personnel at work in the local news sphere in all 50 states. Meso, designated market area. We also have data on the each of the 200 DMAs, which is sort of, for those of you not familiar, in the US, is how we sort of define media markets and how sort of audiences are measured and ad expenditures sort of measured traditionally. Really overlaps with how Nielsen measures television markets, really. But we were able to sort of leverage a couple of data sets that we're using to try to analyze the relationship between the characteristics of individual DMAs and the robustness of their local news infrastructure. Again, infrastructure being defined in terms, for this analysis, outlets and individuals associated with those outlets. And then, which I'm going to talk in a bit more detail about today, this is the work that's in progress, in which the municipality is the unit of analysis. Here we're analyzing not only infrastructure, but also output and performance. So following up, I can't remember the gentleman who made that, I thought, important point at the end of the morning session about needing to actually analyze content and get at this issue of quality, et cetera. That's what we're actually trying to do. We pilot tested it in a couple of New Jersey communities, and Josh talked a bit about that in his talk at lunchtime, and that went well enough and sort of raised enough interesting questions for us that right now we are in progress analyzing 100 municipalities of between 20,000 and 300,000 people in terms of their population. We partnered up with the Internet Archive for this because the amount of content that needs to be gathered and archived to do this kind of work, as we discovered, is pretty massive. And Jefferson Bailey is here to talk today about the Internet Archive's role in this and some of the ways what they do can facilitate all sorts of local journalism-oriented research. And Matt Weber is going to talk today, too, about some different types of network analysis work that can be done with these type of data. So we're going to go in a bunch of different directions today. What we did at the municipality level is we randomly sampled 100 municipalities. We identified, and this sounds like, okay, simple. This is so tedious and so difficult, this simple process, identifying all media outlets located within those municipalities. The available commercial databases are always incomplete. Jessica Mahone is here, and she could talk about, she's probably ready to shoot herself still from work she did a year ago on this, which is, I mean, it's detective work. We found that the work that we do it ourselves is always actually better than what you can find in any one commercial database. But it's such a very sort of dynamic space, outlets coming, outlets going, that it's quite challenging. So we identified all the media outlets located within those municipalities. It comes out to somewhere between 600 and 700 total in terms of then identifying the URLs for all those home pages. And the Internet Archive constructed a weak sample of content for us, homepage plus one link deep. And this is what's going on this summer. We've got about 9-10 research assistants who are content analyzing all of this content through an interface hosted by the Internet Archive. And we're really, and that's something that came up earlier today too, is this idea of scale. How do we do this in a way that gets beyond, being analyzing just a select few communities or a select few issues? And, the answer, unfortunately, is for the analysis to become fairly superficial. I mean, this is about breadth rather than depth. Anyone who's done content analysis of local journalism is going to see what we're doing, and they're going to, it's going to make them very sad because it's, they're like, really, that's it? But for trying to make this scale, we think, in fact, with this combination of fairly basic indicators, we can learn some useful things. But hopefully you agree. So we asked very basically, is the story, right? So the news story becomes the sort of unit of analysis, and as we're even finding that even at that basic level, the question of what does on an individual homepage constitute a news story to be analyzed is often not that easy. So that's a challenge that we first overcome. But then once we overcome that challenge, then the question the coders will just ask, is the story local or not? That is, does it take place in or address issues specific to that municipality? And this is so we code, this is just a yes or a no. And there's, usually fairly straightforward, not always totally straightforward, but we're trying to get at the extent to which there's actual news about the community being produced. Is it original or not? I can't remember the fellow's name, but that interesting example from earlier today where a press release essentially appears as a news story. It reminded me of when I worked in book publishing when I was in graduate school, and I would write a press release for a book. And then some publications would run it as a book review, verbatim. And it was, take my name off it, put their name on it. These are the, those are not old problems, they're not new problems. They've been around forever. But in terms of discerning whether a story is original or not, whether it's actually been produced by the outlet, or at least the parent company of the outlet that we're analyzing, that's something we're trying to get at, to sort of at least make some sort of distinction between sort of linking and aggregating versus actually producing journalism. And there's all sorts of clues we rely on there, from bylines to URLs to, but it's also not without its challenges, certainly. And then lastly, does the story address a critical information need? We actually have 8 categories of critical information need. And if the intercoder reliability holds up, that'll be great, because then we could actually start doing different types of analyses of whether there's, the nature of the reporting and how that differs across communities, subject matter, whether it's economic issues or education, et cetera. These are categories we actually derived for some work we did years back for the Federal Communications Commission for a study that we were all excited about doing, but then that got fairly radioactive politically, and that thing got spiked. There's a whole story there that I always love to tell, so feel free to ask me about it later. I have all sorts of bitterness about that, that I'm always happy to unburden myself of. So for us, for at least this, the real question is more of the binary. Does it or does it not address a critical information need? So these, we think, three sort of basic ways of addressing a news story. There are plenty of others that I know, might also be useful, that we've sort of sacrificed in the name of trying to work at this scale, which is, is challenging. And that work is in progress, and we hope to have results. And the idea there is to ultimately be able to identify with the sort of the community as a unit of analysis, what are the characteristics of individual communities that appear related to the quality, the health, whatever term we want to use, of their local journalism. So we're gathering data on size and population density, proximity to large media markets, some of these things that, that April had brought up in her earlier presentation, that then we're going to sort of incorporate into our multivariate analysis, and hopefully, demographics, ethnicity, some of these issues that emerge in our earlier work as possible factors that, that might be at work here, with the end goal, again, really understanding, what are the characteristics of communities that have a positive or negative effect on the state of their local journalism. Going forward, these are the real reasons we came in many ways, because we want to learn from the folks who are here and get feedback on directions to take this. We don't know yet, but is there value in conducting this type of work, whether at any of these levels we're dealing with, on an annual or biennial basis to start charting trends over time? That's something we're all asking ourselves, whether we want to sort of commit to that, even if folks decide it is the right way to go, because this is all consuming. When we're starting to work at this scale, we're finding it, it's keeping us up at night, and it's a lot. Can or should the content analysis process be automated? That's something we, as we sort of work these research assistants to death, are asking ourselves. But at the same time, we are finding that there are so many complex decisions, and I think Jessica and Katie, folks who've worked on this, would attest to this. It's hard to imagine feeling more confident about the nature of the data if it were handled in some sort of automated way. I don't know if that makes me a Luddite or makes me an old fart, whatever. But it's it's something we're going to look at going forward, because it would certainly make the replicability, the scalability of this, a lot less expensive. And then lastly, could other researchers make use of the content analysis archive or quantitative data for similar or different analyses? We want to make this a tool, and the raw data a resource for folks, because we think there are dozens of different directions these sorts of data could be used for, different from the directions that we're taking it. So that's something we're hoping to learn a bit about, and Jefferson's going to talk a bit more about that actually today. And so all that being said, I'm going to now briefly introduce the rest of the folks who are going to talk about the other components of this work and how they all fit together. We have Jefferson Bailey he's the Director of Web Archiving for the Internet Archive. We've got Matt Weber, Associate Professor at the School of Communication and Information at Rutgers, who I sucked into this last year, and now he's never getting out. And Katie McCullough, who was the primary doctoral research assistant on this project, but is now moving to a position as an assistant professor at Augustana University. Did I get everybody? I did. And I think who's up next?
So I'm Matt Weber from Rutgers University. It's an honor to be here today and have a chance to talk about some of the data work that we've been doing on this research project, and some of the work that we're doing in collaboration now with Duke University and the Internet Archive. I'm going to cheat a little bit and talk about some of the Internet Archive content, given that Jefferson and I have swapped places now, so forgive me for that, Jefferson. Hopefully I won't steal too much of your thunder. Phil, as he mentioned, came to me 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, and talked to me about the work that he'd been doing, measuring and assessing content and quality of local New Jersey news coverage. And he knew a little bit of the work that I'd been doing in partnership with the Internet Archive out in San Francisco, as well as my interests in social network analysis, and said, hey, we want to expand this project out. We have an opportunity here to look more globally across the United States at this 100 community sample that we want to build. And there's a unique opportunity here to take the work you've been doing with the Internet Archive and pair that together with the work that I've been doing on news measures. And I said, great, this works really nicely with my worldview, which is to take the world of media and news media specifically and look at it not from the perspective of understanding what the various outlets are, where the outlets are situated. You have here a map from Stanford University generated in 2010 of US weekly newspapers, but rather I view the world in the perverse way of a network analyst, looking at the connections that exist between media entities, the way in which they're interconnected, the way in which they form partnerships and relationships with one another. Specifically, in the example that you see here, looking primarily at hyperlinks and the sharing and exchanging of content digitally between news media organizations in the online space. This very simple visualization gives you a really quick snapshot and somewhat dated snapshot at this point of the way in which digitally native, let's call them digitally native organizations, and more traditional newspapers working in the online space form connections with one another. And what you see is that through this type of view, you can start to understand and visualize the way in which traditional print newspapers and online-only newspapers began to connect together and form the news ecosystem that Josh was referring to over lunch. And so you start to see that actually play out in the data that you have visualized here. The data that I utilize in this project is data primarily drawn from the Internet Archive, which Jefferson will say a little bit about in a bit. You have here a nice visualization of the actual Internet Archive, the servers that sit in San Francisco and contain much of this data. Currently in excess of 8 petabytes of data. 30? Ooh, my numbers are old. 30 petabytes of data. I don't know where my 8 petabyte number that I have on here came from. Data tracking a whole host of different online and offline elements that would constitute archival data.
Can you tell me how many zeros there are in it? I have it on my slide if you wait.
I told you I won't steal too much of his thunder. But there's some really cool things in the Internet Archive, and in addition to just being able to utilize it to map connections that exist between websites, it gives us this really unique snapshot of what content is and was on news media websites and related websites over time. And it's an incredibly important tool, not only for understanding the connections between news media websites, but also understanding what was on those websites. And as Phil mentioned, we're using much of the archived content from the News Measures Research Project to content analyze local news. Here's just a really quick snapshot of Trump's campaign website, and this actually came to the forefront of media attention last month in May when reporters noticed that the press releases archive that was on his campaign website changed pretty much in the matter of a day. And it was related to a specific set of executive orders that he put forth around immigration. And what happened was he took down his original statement from December 2015 on preventing Muslim immigration, and it disappeared from the live web. And the only place where you could find an existing copy of that was in the Internet Archive, and you can actually still go back and pull that out of the Internet Archive and find that as a record of what had been said at the time. So in addition to being just a tool for mapping and understanding the relationship between these websites, it's also an incredibly important research tool for reporting and understanding the content. Now,
For the U.S. Supreme Court,
sorry?
and maybe for the U.S. Supreme Court.
And potentially. I'm sure Jefferson can say more about some of the, maybe can say more about some of the legal implications. The ways in which these data can be utilized are really mind-boggling when you stop to think about it. I'm going to talk about two specific contexts. I'm going to talk about the global level and the mapping that I've been doing using Internet Archive data, just to give you a sense of what some of the global perspectives look like. And when I say global, I really mean US focused in this case, simply because that's the data that I'm working with. And then I'll say a little bit about the News Measures Research Project specifically and how we're analyzing that data, some of the ways in which we're going to apply the social network analysis view to understanding the local context. So starting first with the global level, I'm going to go back in time, and I'm simply going to use this data because it's a convenient snapshot and it's a nice way to be able to tell the story of what we can look at using Internet Archive data. What you have here is a snapshot of the newspaper website network that existed among the top 25 circulation newspapers in the United States in 1996, starting in the top left, 97, 98, 99, 2000, moving across. And in this work, what we were able to do is we were able to utilize early web data that was collected by the Internet Archive, what they quaintly refer to at times as the 20th century collection, to map out the ways in which early newspapers, early adopters to online news were linking to one another through the stories that they were posting on their websites. Not shockingly, you don't see a lot of this happening in 1996 and 1997, but you do see an increasing frequency of co-linking and linking to one another occurring in 98, 99, and obviously more so in 2000. Interesting to be expected. What we were able to do with the data that we had collected here is we were able to do a large-scale correlation analysis, essentially a really advanced correlation analysis, correlating the different net linking profiles of these websites against one another. So for instance, taking the LA Times linking profile, who they linked to in 1996, and correlating that against the New York Times. We repeated that for each of these years going through to 2000. And what we found is that as these newspapers were adopting web technology and more aggressively linking, they were mimicking one another. And there is a statistically significant degree of mimicry in the way in which they are linking out to different types of content. So an example of that would be not this. This is just to give you a sense of what the New York Times looked like online in 1997. But it's a trip back. But things like this, where these aggregator pages that are put up and were put up very early on, linking to news from the Associated Press. And you start to see this mirroring where one newspaper would do this and they'd put up an AP site, and then the next newspaper would do this, and the next newspaper would do this. And there's this clear and significant mimicry effect that we see playing out as these companies are adapting to web technology. And we know through correlated qualitative research today that we're seeing similar patterns play out with regards to adoption to mobile technology. Now, the local level talks specifically about the News Measures Research Project. Phil mentioned the 100 communities that we selected. This is 100 communities, population between 20,000 and 300,000. This just gives you a quick mapping of where those communities are located. We've been collecting and aggregating a constructed weak sample, which we're now in the process of content analyzing. I've been, in the meantime, with the team that's at Rutgers, working on the network component of this, starting to play with some ways that we can actually analyze the network data and some of the data contained in the Internet Archive in meaningful ways. So I'm going to throw out a few examples. These are very rough and preliminary, as some test ideas that we've developed for ways in which we can take the archive data and use it to meaningfully understand local coverage. So one example comes from an analysis of data that was collected at the beginning of this project, looking at the nj.com domain, paired with the News Measures Research Project. We had some additional web archive data that allowed us to go back in time to 2007 and look at both the number of web pages and the amount of data on those web pages within this domain. And looking at the nj.com domain, what we started to see is this trend over time where the number of web pages that existed in the domain was increasing significantly, but the average amount of data per web page was decreasing at the same time significantly. So this starts to tell you that this web domain, and we expect and suspect that as we start to replicate this, we'll see this in other contexts, the web domains are becoming bigger. The amount of content, even though you're layering in photos, even though you're layering in other types of data, the amount of content's becoming smaller. So more web pages, less content on them. So an interesting trend that we're seeing here. There's some messiness in this data that may be contributing to this. We've got a little more work to do here, but the idea that we can look at the amount of data and pair that against the amount of web pages gives us a nice, easy metric for understanding what is on these domains. We're able to look at the way in which the domains within a local ecosystem interact with one another based on how tightly connected they are to one another. So this is all of the websites that we have in New Jersey from 2007 to 2012, bouncing back and forth and springing together based on how tightly connected they are to one another. And a connection here is hyperlinking between two websites. So for instance, nj.com and philly.com, nj.com in the middle and philly down in the bottom left, become more tightly connected as the network becomes more dense, as there are more hyperlinks, as they interact more, and then actually starts to fall apart a little bit at the end of the loop. And I apologize that there's not a good time bar on the bottom, but they come together and they fall apart as the NJ local news ecosystem seems to crumble a bit. This is over time. You're seeing from 2007, I'll start it, here's 2007, and it's going to bounce forward now. It's going 2008, 2009, 10, 11 starts to explode outward, and then it starts to contract again, lose some of its density as we get into 2012. And so some interesting ways that we can visualize and understand the way in which the local news ecosystem is evolving. It's on a loop, so we're going to keep traveling back in time. And then the last idea that we're playing with, and this is the most recent experiment that we're cooking up, is we're trying to map out where these local news websites are linking to. So by that I mean, what do we mean by local? So for a website like NJ Penn that's in Camden County in New Jersey, where are they linking to? Where is the content actually pointing to? So for instance, in this case we have Camden County, New Jersey pointing to a story that talks about coverage at Rutgers and talks specifically about New Brunswick in the article, and that's 55 miles away. But it's related to Camden, but we're talking about content that's not in Camden, it's 55 miles away. And so we have this idea that we've been playing with in a very manual way right now, that we can start to look at hyperlinks, and through a combination of mapping where the IP addresses are geolocated, paired with what cities, what states are mentioned in the bylines and the content, we can start to understand the width, the breadth of coverage of these local news websites to get some sense of what the actual coverage of local for these organizations is. And so you start to see here 3 that we've been playing with, and we're trying to come up with these heat maps that indicate how wide-reaching the coverage is. So this is work that will be expanding as we start to look more broadly at the 100 community sample and as we start to automate the work that we're presenting here. And with that, I want to quickly give acknowledgement to the Democracy Fund, which has funded much of this work, but also Institute of Museum and Library Services, NSF, and the Internet Archive, each of whom has supported the tool development, the data collection of this work, and the team that goes behind this, because I do not do this work alone. This big data type research takes a huge team to do in a lot of time, and I'm grateful for that support. Thank you.
Thank you to the Ryerson crew for this awesome event and for having us, and obviously thanks to Phil and Matt and Democracy Fund for getting us involved in this project, which I think is a great example of both research intent pairing with, for us, preservation intent. And I'll talk about Internet Archive as a research resource, what we do and stuff like that, how people can use the archive, but also some, I think, reciprocal projects that both preserve content for the purpose of research, but also for, of course, historic preservation. So I guess the other thing I was thinking earlier when I was hearing people talk about journalism as the first draft of history is that the archive is the last draft of history. Let's see.
Nobody's invented the term fake archive.
Right. Yep, so there I just talk about, what Internet Archive is, some of our other research services that we're involved in, especially in news and media stuff, and then a bit about what we do in the News Measures Research Project. So we are a nonprofit digital library in California, San Francisco. We are working in a former church. We are open to the public. We do run some of our data servers out of the building and have a free open to the public lunch every Friday. If you're ever in San Francisco, interested in visiting the building, drop me a line or get in touch and come by. We were founded in 1996 by an early internet entrepreneur, sort of semi-famous for a lot of early internet technology development, and used his crazy internet money to build a digital version of the Library of Alexandria, is the intent. So we are also a technology company, even while we are a nonprofit library. And the mission is universal access to all knowledge. So you wanted the numbers, here are some numbers. I actually don't know how many bytes that is. It's whatever is over a trillion. But it is 30 petabytes unique content, so obviously we have multiple copies of that, so I'm sure that we're over 100 petabytes totally across the data centers. We preserve software. We are focused on digitizing stuff and preserving that digital stuff, as well as born digital acquisition and preservation. So software, and you can see all the numbers. So it's always in the millions, if not in the billions. And the Wayback Machine is what we're best known for. Have people here, I assume, hopefully, used the Wayback Machine, know what it is? Yay? Okay, cool. We get about 700,000 unique users every day. It's about half of the archive in size, so it's 15 of the 30 petabytes, more or less, and 560 billion URLs. So it is global. It's not the entire internet/web, but we do collect, across the world. So not just US or .com, and at a rate of about 1 billion a week. We also work with at least 500, 600 different institutions who use us as a service provider for building their own web archives. Library of Congress, national libraries across the world, universities, nonprofits, all sorts of organizations that are also interested in preservation or research acquisition methods. So that'll come into play when I talk a little bit more about the News Measures project. There's lots of ways to use news content in Internet Archive. TV, I'll talk a little bit about our TV news archive. We do both global and curated web news archiving, and then I'll talk a little bit about research and computational data sets. So we have been recording about 50 channels of TV all day, every day since 2000, and we're up to almost about 100 now. It's 5 million hours, 5 minutes, oh my God. It's a lot of stuff. It's searchable, you can get snippets, you can embed them and quote little snippets of local, global, international news. We get about 100 million URLs per week that are specific news articles through a bunch of different feeds of different research projects that are scanning the web for news stories and giving us the URLs, and then we archive them. We get a lot of people that also contribute URLs via Save Page Now, which is part of the Wayback Machine. You can enter a URL and we'll save it. It's actually how a lot of things that get disappeared off the web really quickly are preserved by citizens and activists putting it in to the Wayback Machine themselves. So that's pretty awesome. I mentioned working with so many organizations. A lot of them are collecting local news online via web archive collections that they're building and maintaining themselves. So that's another big area of acquisition. We have lots of research partnerships, lots of funding agencies, as well as self-sustaining services that are all focused on news and even broader topics of the web that we're trying to archive and make available. So, others on the News Measures project will talk a little bit more about the specifics of that one. But, Matt mentioned the New Jersey news media. We've also worked with people that are doing event-based news collections, so floods, disasters, things of that nature, and they're interested in grabbing as much as they can from their local community to document those events as they're reported online. And then, of course, the disappeared news and sites and domains that are no longer online. Some interesting research partnerships I thought would be good to give a quick highlight out. This person wrote a blog about hyperlocal news and blogs after Katrina and how they helped bring New Orleans together, wrote a book about it, sent us the book, and was like, I love the Wayback Machine. And I was like, why don't we just find all the blogs in the Wayback Machine and make a special collection of them? And then people can go and actually look at the websites or in addition to reading about the research in a book. And so we did that, and there's a URL, and we did a blog and interview with her, so I thought that was a good way of taking research that used Wayback Machine and then building a special collection so that people could go and look at the project. And we're also about to launch a grant that is supporting public libraries as local history and local news preservation entities. So they'll work with us to identify blogs, especially hyperlocal content, community newsletters, other stuff that is online documenting community memory, local history, and work with us to preserve that stuff. And we do similar efforts on, Ferguson was a big one. We work with Washington University, East Baton Rouge Public Library. There's when they had the big flooding. So there's lots of work with communities and local institutions to preserve local news as documented online. I won't go into too much of the types of researchers that we work with because I'm running low on time. Political scientists, social scientists, journalists, computer scientists, so lots of different ways of content analysis, but also computational research. Web archives have a lot of challenges in using them. They're huge, they're complex. The way that the data is collected and then made available is a little obtuse to item level analysis. It's really, you're gonna have to work at scale for any sort of analysis of a big web archive collection. So there's some technical and conceptual issues in research that I think we're all getting a lot better at. So for the NMRP project, we basically did the web archiving portion, as well as generating the research data sets and managing the crawls. And so the web is kind of a messy thing to work with, and it takes a lot of curation and technical configuration about how the crawler is gonna happen and go out and make sure that it gets great archival quality snapshots of all these web pages. So we use a sort of curatorial web application. You can see that the project ended up like well over 2 terabytes of total data, but like over 19 million documents. Document can sort of mean anything, it just means URLs, but generally at least a quarter of those are text, HTML, or PDF. So, you know, you're talking in the millions of textual items to do content analysis on, so have fun with that, guys. There's just an example of, you know, just you can see this is just one crawl on one of the sample days, and it's, you know, over 250 gigabytes, and it's however many, over 100,000 text HTML pages. So that's a lot of text to work with. There was 663 local news sites, 100 communities, as others have mentioned. We ran a composite week, so 7 different crawls, very tightly scoped and big scale, but just for a single day, but across different months so that it ended up, and you see the stats there. I think as I wrap up, we're excited to announce the NMRP team is still doing the content analysis, but, and so we didn't want to necessarily make the collection public yet, but I made it public a couple of days ago because Phil told me I could via email, so I just went in with my system administration powers and made it public. So you can go and look at all the archival captures of the web pages from the whole collection. We'll also be releasing, I didn't quite have time to make them all public, the data sets underneath that. So both the raw content as well as things like extracted named entities, some of the link information that Matt was demonstrating via network graphs, what links to what on what day. It's like a graph analysis file that we can generate. Full page text, if you don't want to look at the thing, you just want the text extracted from the web page, we'll be making those data sets available too. So a whole range of data sets that should be able to support different types of computational analysis, or even just playing around with in other ways. And you can see there's an archival banner that tells you what day it is and what collection this page was captured on, and so we're just had a couple of screenshot examples. This is what it looks like in the public access interface. So you can scroll and click on the URL, and it'll take you to a page that gives you all the snapshots. So what we are going to do, this is such an amazing collection. They did a lot of awesome, really mind-boggling work in identifying these 100 communities and having a real representative sample of local news that is obviously over 600 individual sites. So that is something we could never do. So we're just going to keep archiving it after the project is over. So there's a segmented part of it that is just for studying the project, but we're just going to keep crawling it every month or every 2 weeks or so for continued use in research. And so that's pretty much the quick and dirty of the project. I also wanted to throw out, if people don't know the Dodging the Memory Hole project, it's about preserving online news specifically. I think it has a lot of good overlaps with this project and this event. And we'll be hosting the 2017 version at Internet Archive, not announced yet, but should be announced in the next couple of weeks. So if you're interested in coming to San Francisco in November, which should be lovely, look out for announcements about this event. That's it. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. First of all, thank you to all the organizers. And I'm going to talk today about the macro and the meso level, if you can think back to Phil's presentation at the start. And besides the organizers, I also want to thank all the multiple people that have been involved and helped with this. Special thank you to Jessica, who's right there. Say hi. for really helping with this project, for Ian and Allie, and also Ian Napoli. So we're looking to assess the local news infrastructure, but what exactly do we mean by local news infrastructure? And we're really looking at two kind of elements of that. One is the number of news outlets, so we're thinking in terms of outlets, and secondarily in terms of the number of news workers. And I'm going to be talking about this at the macro, at the state level, and at the meso, at the DMA level. And this, what we did for the work that I'm presenting on today is we utilized the Cision Media Database, which is this really amazing, it's used for by PR professionals, marketing, different people to kind of keep track of different outlets and also keep contacts within those outlets. It includes, all the media in an area, so not just newspapers, but also TV, radio, and online. And we did an extensive amount of filtering, I can speak to that, about in order to make sure that we were focusing on the outlets that were actually local news producing outlets. So in order to do that, the filtering process within kind of the database, the Cision database, they have like filters that you can pull down. So we included outlet types like college newspapers, community newspapers, daily newspapers, radio stations and networks, television stations and networks, blogs, news websites, and online versions. And one of the things these are the categories that Cision has that we're sort of working within. But we excluded things like newspaper bureaus, special sections, radio programs, television programs, and social networking sites and like photo or video sharing sites, because we really want to be focused on the outlet, right? We're not focused on a bureau, we're focused on like trying to find the number of outlets as our unit of analysis for the infrastructure. So we filtered, another filter we used for, as far as the content filter went, was, or subject matter, was news and current events. So all of the kind of, you go within a DMA and you filter things that address news and current events would come up. And this is not just limited to news organizations. And then, so we remove things like that are more focused on product reviews or on product sites. So, like a mommy blog that's focused on kind of product promotion or things, that might be something that's of interest to a PR professional, but wasn't actually producing news stories. So that would be something that we went through and we could click, and it has like a description of the site, and then you can, if you weren't sure, and we did kind of as a team collaborated to make, the really me, right, like collaborated to make sure that when you click on the site that it really was a news producing site. So there are a lot of things like a newsletter for like a commercial organization or like a car dealership or something. So, yes. So we also removed outlets with a state, national, or international focus. And so this is something like, if you're in Atlanta, okay, you're gonna get a lot of CNN, right? So CNN is like international focus. And so not necessarily something that we would want to capture because it would completely skew the data. We also removed TV stations that did not include news departments, towers, repeaters, multicast. Again, we're just trying to find the number of outlets. So this involved a lot of filtering to kind of filter out the duplicates in a way. And then we also removed radio stations that didn't have a news focused on their content. So again, we're trying to focus on those outlets that are actually producing news, local news. We also, so part of the learning process of this is that we, the way that Cision organizes the data is they have the online version, so you'll have the New York Times and you'll have the online version of the New York Times, right? And so we ended up not double counting the New York Times and the online version of the New York Times, but we kept it in for the number of news workers because we found that there would be workers that were included with the online version that weren't in the database for the print version. Sorry, throat's really dry. So anyway, and then we went through and this is the fun part, and took out all the duplicate names, right? So you go through and you're looking by last name, and then you had to check by first name. And this is like a little fun fact for you, how many families there are. So you really like would come and there would be like Jones, 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 and then there'll be like Amelia, John, like all these different individuals with the same last name. So you could almost see like, oh, this is a family endeavor. So with the state level analysis, how did we start to compare that? Because states are so completely different in terms of their geography, the demographics, the population, the size, the density, all these different factors. So when we did the multivariate analysis, one of the things that they showed, for instance, is that population size was overwhelmingly the most significant factor, but it's not something that you can directly compare, right? The news outlet, the number of outlets, and say Iowa with the number of outlets in, say, California, right? That would not be a fair comparison. You have to kind of filter that the size of the infrastructure is going to be influenced by population and density. So we actually did a controlled for population size. So we looked at kind of the number of outlets and news workers per 100,000 residents. And what we did was we produced a scatter plot. So you can see that it's actually, by the dotted line, it's more logarithmic than linear, because if you think about kind of in terms of economies of scale, that when you there might be larger audiences might have fewer, more fixed cost kind of situation, and so like it actually kind of makes sense that that there would be larger states might actually have fewer workers because of economies of scale. So if we look at this, it indicates which states have more and fewer outlets than we expected based on if they're below or above the line. So for instance, Iowa is way above the line, right? And then I think this is Nevada. Yeah, Jersey, right, is way below the line. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. So then we divided the difference between the actual, where they were on the above or below the line, and the expected or the dotted line, okay? And Jessica produced these awesome maps for us, right, that show who's overperforming and who's underperforming in terms of the number of local outlets when we control for population. So you can see that the percent deviation, so the red is those who are underperforming, who are 20% and below. The yellow is sort of the middle road, who are between, and then the green is those who sort of were above or what we expected, right? So, so these are the underperforming and overperforming states regarding in terms of the outlets. And then you can see this in terms of the numbers of workers. So again, those in red are 20%, below where they should be on the line. Those in yellow are 15%, and those are in green are above or on the line. Okay, so what's going on? Okay, well, you might not have been able to see, I might have gone too quickly, not sure. But you can tell that the Northeast had quite an area of red. And so we think that this might be due to our experiences in New Jersey and maybe other sites too, to the proximity to large out-of-state markets, and that might undermine kind of the ability of those local markets to produce news. Also, kind of a surprising finding or something we found was that the Mountain West, I don't know if you noticed, like the Rockies basically, were in red, right? We're underperforming, and that's something that we need to explore further, needs further explanation. So the bottom line is that there was substantial variation in the state of the local news infrastructure when we looked at it on a state-by-state basis. Okay, so the next, that was the macro at the state level. With the meso at the DMA level, or which Phil explained is the designated market area. So it's, encompasses a metropolitan area and kind of the market that it covers. There's been kind of this concern about journalism having spaces that have news and have nots, right? This is something that we talked about with the state level data. But there's also kind of been a lot of questions about how much is this a function of economic or demographic characteristics of those communities or markets. And this is a way that we could kind of potentially hope to answer some of these questions or get, some clues. So are the community characteristics related to the robustness of the local news infrastructures? And so we're trying to look at this on a larger scale. So how we were able to do, right, again, we're looking at the infrastructure as the dependent variable, so that included the news outlets and the news workers. It's kind of similar filtering process was used. And then the independent variables, we're able to use, BIA-Kelsey has kind of some variables that they keep track of that we were able to utilize, including population, the total population for each DMA, the over-the-air revenue, which is the gross over-the-air advertising revenue, and then the total personal income per household, so kind of getting at economic wealth of an area, and African-American population, so the percent of the population that is African-American, and the percent of the population that is Hispanic, and those were the two minority groups that they had data for by BIA-Kelsey. Okay, so our results have quite a few of the variables were, 4 out of the 5 were significant. And one thing I want to hone in on is kind of the negative relationship between, the negative and significant relationship between minority population and between the number of news workers and outlets. So you can see for both African-American community and Hispanic or Latino community that there is a negative relationship. So that means that there are less news workers and outlets when the population of African-American and Hispanic population. And then there was a positive significant relationship for population and income. Okay, so in conclusion, what this finding seems to indicate is that lower income, more ethnically diverse communities are being served have less robust news infrastructures. They have less workers and less outlets than wealthier, less ethnically diverse communities. And the significance, right, of income, minority population variables highlight the possibility, right, that there are journalism divides. It seems like we do have empirical support that there are journalism divides akin to the digital divides of internet access. And that kind of, this is the key takeaway that I'll end on, is that while policymakers seem to pay substantial attention to bolstering kind of technical dimensions of the community infrastructure, our results point that attention to the institutional dimensions, such as the number of workers and outlets, is also an important for policymakers to pay attention to. So thank you everyone for your time.
Oh yeah, I gotta come to the mic.
Get in line.
Go, go.
I'm just trying to remember your name, Catherine.
Katie.
Katie, sorry, yeah.
No, it's okay. It's very close.
Yes, great presentation, very close. I'm sorry?
I don't think your mic is on.
Your mic is on.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Beth.
Yeah. I mean, is this working? Okay. Yes, very similar to the work we're doing in Quebec. So, and with different data sources, but, we're all arriving at well, of course we're using your work, but it's very, very close. I'm wondering why you didn't use education as a variable. I'm sure that race that's part of the equation. And if you are considering using that variable as well, if it's possible to combine those three variables, if education is a significant predictor, because I think those probably income and race probably all kind of play together. But of course, I'm not as familiar with the U.S. situation.
I'm trying to remember if we had, at the state level, if we had it and drop, we did drop some, I don't remember, but yeah, that would be, I want to go back and check that.
I wonder if it's in because we use the Kelsey database.
Well, yeah, I mean, for the DMA level, that was the thing. At the DMA level,
level.
there's very little of
It's
this
not in
sorts
the
of stuff gets
database.
measured at the DMA unit. But at
Yeah.
the state level, for the initial sort of multivariate stuff we did, like one of the things we expected to matter was something like population density, and it didn't. But I can't remember if we included education, like I'm sure there are data at the average level of
It's
education
usually a
per state.
natural,
Yeah.
it's considered a natural kind of environmental factor for
Yeah,
media
no.
presence, the education and income.
Yeah, we
of
should check
course.
that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
But great work, thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you everyone for giving very interesting talks. I'm a security researcher, and so I often look for, there's two things. The question would be directed to the gentleman from the Internet Archive. Two things that sort of fluster me a little bit is, by the way, I use it all the time.
Excellent.
Numerous
hear.
times a week.
Thank
Okay,
you.
so online news from mainstream media that later finds its way into a print edition, particularly newspapers. Okay, so you'll have somebody who will write an article, put it online, then it'll get edited, within an hour, a couple of hours, and then a new version appears, but the hyperlink is exactly the same, and the old version is completely gone. And sometimes the old version is what I'm looking for, and I can't find it. I have to beg the journalist, please, send me your work. That's one of the things I wanted to ask, if there's any sort of workaround, or if there's any way to get that. Second thing is, we had extensive national security consultations in Canada at the end of last year, like in the fall of last year. So I was doing a lot more research than I would usually do. And I found that certain sites that could have nourished and informed the process were, like on the Internet Archive, for example, were not available, although they were available before. So it's interesting the timing as to how that happened, but it did happen. So I just wonder if you could speak to that.
First question was frequency of capture, as we call it. It depends on the sites. There's hundreds, if not thousands, of crawls happening every day at Internet Archive. Some of them run by us, some of us run by people using our services. So you can set a frequency at which a crawler visits a web page to archive it, and we do have deduplication, so if it hasn't changed, it won't capture it a second time. But generally, the highest frequency is probably going to be twice a day. So these are all automated crawls, right? They run. So we press a button or the equivalent, and they go. So if something has changed in a 1 hour time span, it could very well not be archived. The web is super dynamic. It's very hard to do localized replay, right? So you go to a website and the ads are all related to Toronto stuff or whatever. Localization is a browser thing. It's not a crawler thing. So there's obviously a news story will be a news story. Some of the surrounding, weather page will have a dynamic map, and the crawler's only visiting it once a day or at most. So it's never going to be possible to capture every version of everything, which is why I think it's good to have such an active user base that is contributing URLs into Save Page Now, which is a box on Wayback Machine where you can put a URL and it'll capture it right then. So to the first question of something changing between times that it is archived, yes, it's possible. But it depends. Sometimes some things we only try to archive once a month, or once a year, or once every 4 months. So the frequency of archiving can vary a lot.
And on the next one, just any comments at all on?
So it was a page that was in the Wayback Machine and then was not?
Well, yeah, I could give you, I'll tell you afterwards, but I mean, there was a specific site, which actually was even up at one point,
On the web or?
on the open web.
Yes.
This was information on that site which would have nourished the consultation process in the national security reviews here in Canada that were happening in the fall of last year. The page was gone, okay? And then the Internet Archive version of the page histories were all, you know, they were pointing to some bizarre things, so I could never get that information again.
Yeah, if you can give me the example, I can look into it.
I
It
will-
sounds like a technical issue, not.
Okay, I'll come and
you're-
talk to you afterwards.
yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, guys. So a couple of thoughts and observations. I've heard from this panel that newspapers are the first draft of history, and the Internet Archives the last draft of
Just
history.
archives in general, not just the
Archives in
Internet
general is the last draft of history. And for people of color who are not represented in either of those places, to any great sense, we're doomed to repeat our history if it's not a full and complete one. And so some observations in looking at and the work that you're doing in the Internet Archive, et cetera. I know we use those as a source of capturing what we think of as authentic and or authoritative sources. However, we're missing the stories of communities that aren't being captured in these spaces. And so I think it's critical that we recognize that. And in the network mapping, we see that same kind of homophily happening where we have legacy media circling the drain around each other instead of reaching outside of that network to the diverse networks and blogs and stories, et cetera, that exist to help inform and provide that kind of total community coverage. So as we're looking at this work, understanding kind of the history that's going into this and the replication of that history through the algorithms of the Internet Archive and other types of ways in which we're preserving what might be history. It was just a comment for you, Matthew, on the content, the decrease in content per page. I wonder if you could attribute that to that click mentality and the ways in which people were slicing up articles and just putting a paragraph per page. That strategy, in order to be able to drive viewership and clicks, would marry with the data that you saw there in the ways in which the content actually went down in some of those places. I think just moving forward in the work that we're all doing in this area, yes, the research will show you numerically that income, education, and ethnicity are indeed factors in the lack of news and information in an area. I think we know that. And yes, we must institutionally do something as well. But what are we doing structurally to ensure those voices are part of what we're preserving as part of our historical record? That is really my target of my work, is not local news and information, but history. And if the mechanisms that we're creating as researchers is not preserving that history, then we're doomed to repeat it. So thank you.
I just want to add one quick comment to that. I really appreciate the remarks you just made, and I, on that note, have to give acknowledgement to Burgess Jewell's Doc Now project, which does seek in some way to the Doc Now project, which does seek in some way to capture some of the missing communities that aren't captured in some of the analyses that we talked about here. I also think the Dodging the Memory Hole conference has been a venue where that type of preservation has come up in a notable way, and hopefully will continue to, and it's been a good forum for discussing exactly the issues you just raised.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. And so we have this upcoming project, Community Webs, which is the people selecting the content on the web for preservation will be from the community. Public librarians are who we work with the most, and so they're sort of the focal points. But it's similar to Doc Now, which is a project. It's a little more oriented on communities on Twitter and how activism and local coordination on community issues happens on social media. And so we're doing a similar idea, but for websites that document communities. So, and a lot of the Internet Archive stuff, we have our global crazy big crawls that are automated. But the service that we used for the News Measures project is one that is used mostly by librarians and archivists in universities or historical societies or local and state governments to select whatever they want. We just do the archiving for them, but don't select the content. So I think that model has a lot of potential, as well as with researchers, some of the projects that we mentioned, to diversify the content in the archive, which I think is super exciting.
So I wanted to, Philip Savage from McMaster University. For my sins, a few years ago, I worked with a colleague in which we tried to do a content analysis of all of the question period, you may not know what that means, in the Canadian Parliament. And we were trying to look at the degree to which it was rhetorical and levels of politeness. So I feel your pain. First of all, because of the huge amount of capture and coding, and that's, but also the training of coders, because there was no way we could automate this. There was no way. And so countless generations of undergraduate students in research methods courses who are sort of, hey, you should try this coding thing. It's a very interesting, and then, anyway, I feel your pain. Okay. But I want to add a little more pain to it. So I do a lot of work, I think, Phil, we may have talked about this before, in terms of public service broadcasting and the degree to which public service media changes the sort of ecosystem. So my question is, are you able to do the analysis, or have you thought to do the analysis about where you do have public service media very present in markets, whether that actually adds to the localness of coverage? And please do it if you don't. You don't have that data.
We have the data for that. Yeah, we could absolutely do that. Yeah. So at the municipality level, where we're actually analyzing the content, we could. Yeah, we have. All
because there are
sorts
certain places where there's a very strong NPR presence, right, and others where there isn't so much. So that would be.
But it's tricky because there's this sort of causality, which is, what explains the presence of the NPRs? That's sort of the mindset we brought to it, right? Is there what are the types of communities that have them? And so really what we're at, there's more of a sort of path analysis perhaps ultimately to happen where we could sort of disentangle some causality, which is the nice thing, which we're actually talking about doing work at this scale with this much data and of this large, we could start to do that sort of thing.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Follow up with you at some point.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Carrie Buchanan. I'm at John Carroll University in the Cleveland area, but originally Canadian. I was talking with Jeff at lunchtime about an issue that I think is significant. And so I thought I would get up and say something about it. I am doing a deep dive on 3 hyperlocal media and the quality of the content and the degree of localness in those media. And I've discovered that one of them is Patch.com, which sort of went out of business but is still around in 2013. And I managed to capture everything just before they got sold. So my sample actually is Patch at full strength. When I go back in the Internet Archive to try and get those pages again, they've been removed. I believe they were there, but they're not there anymore. And I have a hypothesis about why that might have happened, but Jeff, you had a really interesting explanation, and I just thought everybody should hear about it.
Sure. I mean, if you are a site owner and you ask for something not to be displayed in the Wayback Machine that has been captured via automatic global scale crawling, then it will not be accessible. So we, just like in other copyright works, it's legal precedent to remove content from access via the Wayback Machine at the request of the content owner. And that's true for any type of content that is created after 1923 in the United States. So anything before 1923 is public domain, but copyright law is changed by Congress all the time, as we know.
Every time Mickey Mouse is about to expire.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, the Mickey Mouse law. Sonny Bono to thank for that one.
So I feel that this is something of a danger to some of these records. In the case of Patch.com, it depends on who is the owner of those previous iterations of Patch.com, whether it's still AOL or whether the new owner actually has copyright over those old sites. And it would be in the interest of the new owner not to have people see how good it used to be, you see, what people used to get from Patch.com. And in Canada, we have Postmedia. So I'm seeing a danger that this might happen in a very large scale somewhere else, where somebody might attempt to take all the old versions of Postmedia out of the Internet Archive because they wouldn't want anybody to see how good they used to be when I worked there. That's just something I wanted to flag. I think it's a significant issue. If this stuff is a public trust, maybe there needs to be some kind of movement to keep news in the public domain, even though it's privately owned. I don't know. But
This is unrelated to this project, but one of my first projects on New Jersey local news was a content analysis of the Star Ledger, and I was supposed to do 2006, 2003, 2006, 2000. Well, basically the bottom line is 2006, I was unable to get a copy of the Star Ledger in August. For 2006 because the Rutgers University libraries were transitioning onto digital and they didn't keep the microfilm. It was like that weird transition time, right? So I just want to say, like, this is a problem of archives. That I couldn't find a copy of the Star Ledger for an entire year. And so we couldn't do a content analysis of that year because it just didn't exist. So that's my
I think
anecdote.
this could be our last one. I know we're running a little over.
Okay. My name is Maggie Patterson, and I'm from Duquesne University in Pittsburgh, bitter enemy of Cleveland, by the way. My question is for Jefferson, and I was wondering about the international access to your project in light of countries that censor, for example, China, and also the right to be forgotten in Europe, how that affects how people from other countries access your site.
So archive.org is blocked in China, but China blocks thousands, if not millions, of websites. We happen to be one of them.
The whole thing.
Yep, I think we're maybe blocked in Iran for a while. So, we have no control over what a country decides to do with its local network access policies. But it is a thing. But Google is also blocked in lots of places, as are other information seeking or information providing services. So I think that's bad. I don't think countries should block citizens' access to information online. I'm going to assume that's not a super provocative position to take. So it happens. Yeah, there's nothing that we as an institution can do about that. Except
And do you know anything about the right to be forgotten? Do people have the right, Europeans have the right to remove information about them?
So my understanding of the European right to be forgotten legislations is that it mostly is applicable, and I could be wrong. I'm not a lawyer, and it's a complex issue in Europe, and it's not really clear how the legislation is enforced. But my understanding as an individual, not as a representation of the legal profession or the United States or Internet Archive, is that it mostly applies to the content creating platform.
I think it just applies actually just to search returns. In other words, the actual news site is under no obligation to remove the actual story.
But he's a certain, but I don't know what your classification is. Is it a search site?
Are we a news site? No.
The question is, are you a search engine?
Are we a search
You're an
engine?
archive.
No.
I think you'd be okay.
No, we're just a library.
So no one's ever come after you and said, hey, this, under right to be forgotten, you can't archive this page anymore.
If it's a person's web page, then they could ask for it not to be displayed. In the
Right,
archive,
under more of a copyright issue, but like not under, like.
Yeah,
in other words,
I
If a person didn't like the way they were portrayed in a news story.
Oh,
And
right.
under right to be forgotten, Google can't index that page anymore.
Right.
I don't think that, it doesn't
I don't think that
prohibit
applies to the
you from
news
archiving that
site.
page.
I don't think that's,
because Der Spiegel would still have its archive,
Yeah,
presumably,
yeah,
available.
yeah, so I.
yeah. I mean, we don't, it's the
It's
right to be
interesting.
forgotten is kind of a EU thing that
They'll
nobody.
come at you eventually.
The EU?
Make your life difficult.
I think it's a complex issue of people understanding how things are on the internet these days, right? I mean, if you put something on the internet, people are going to be able to access it.
All right, everybody, thank you so much. I think we've got time for, there's a little brief break before the next session starts up at 2:30? 3:30.